Hi, friends. It's Brittany Valadez for BravelyDaily.com. All right, today I am chatting with Rebecca George. Yes, she is the author of the new book, Do the Thing. If you guys haven't, I'd love for you to subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you can be notified each time that I upload a new video to this channel. Also, make sure to share this video. And if you haven't, follow me on social media. I love to ask you guys questions and get your feedback. And then I also like to seek out questions from you to ask the talent that I have here on my channel. All right. You know what? Let's just get started. Hi, Rebecca. It's so nice to meet you. Tell us about your new book, Do the Thing. I just started reading it and I love it.
Oh,
I love
awesome. That's always so fun to have a conversation with someone who's read your work. So this feels super exciting and it's so fun to finally get to talk about it. This is my first book. And as I have sort of began tugging on that thread that's sort of woven throughout my life, this was one of those threads that kept popping up of not only the discouragement and maybe roadblocks I've faced in my own calling, but those that I've seen in the lives of other women, right? I would speak somewhere and often, and you'll relate to this, Brittany, being a communicator yourself, the conversations you have after you step off a stage are most often my very favorite. And so I would stand at the back of the room with these women. And for many years, early on in my 20s, God led me to start this ministry where we donated handmade hats and handwritten letters of encouragement to cancer treatment centers all over the country. And as I was doing this work and sharing about it and speaking about it, women would come to me after an event and say something to the effect of, I love what God did through your mom's story and this ministry that he inspired you to start. And I feel like I have my own version of that. I feel my heart stirred towards a specific area where I feel I can use my gifts and talents to the glory of God. And almost every time, Brittany, they would hush to a whisper and something would be holding them back. Sometimes it was fear, doubt, insecurity. Maybe they were terrified to take that first step of faith towards that very thing God was calling them to do. And those were many of the same roadblocks that I experienced in my own story. And so as I began to explore what it might look like to write a book, and I did feel very called to this work, I just started asking God, what's that thread that you want me to tug on and kind of unweave as I unpack, a message? And this was what kept coming up. And so I'm super excited to get to have these conversations where we get to talk more about what it looks like to use what God's given us to build his kingdom.
Oh, I completely agree with you. I do want to know, though, how do we know if we are just not ready to do the thing, as the book title goes, and maybe we're just scared, or if we're genuinely not ready and, I mean, prepared to do the thing because we don't have maybe the proper education or the right, insert whatever. How do we know the difference?
Yeah. Well, I'll share a moment of my own story to illustrate this. Very early on in my career, for the first 7 or 8 years, I was a corporate recruiter. And I would probably have told you at that age, just coming out of college and into my first kind of big girl job, that I felt called to ministry in some way. But what I didn't necessarily feel called to was a very traditional, maybe women's ministry director role in the within the four walls of my local church, right? And it's not lost on me that I ended up marrying a pastor and am very entrenched in the life of my local church and always have been, always will be. And yet I felt like I had these gifts that God desired to use. I just didn't know what that looked like. And sometimes we are in those seasons, which is kind of the first part of what you're alluding to. And here's the gift I didn't know that God was giving me in that season. As a corporate recruiter, I spent the majority of my days inside an office at a job where I learned how to ask people really good questions, right? I interviewed people all day long and hired great talent for the couple of organizations that I worked for. And here's why that matters. 7 or 8 years later, God called me to start a podcast where all I would do is ask people great questions, which was a skill that I had built in this area of my life where it may have felt very mundane and insignificant in many days, right? And so don't despise, I would start there of don't despise where God may have you today, because it is so likely that he will use what he's building and refining in you now for where he's going to call you later. right? And so even if you feel a stirring, sometimes it's not the season. And God gives us that discernment through his Holy Spirit to know, okay, ultimately, I feel a call here, but for today, I'm going to trust that, God has me planted in this season or in this specific role or assignment for a reason, and he's building something in me. I also think, and I know from just personal experience, there are those moments where something is bubbling up in us, right? And our hearts are stirred towards something. Brittany, I would be willing to imagine when God put this idea of this podcast and this area of your calling and your assignment on your heart, there was a day where you had to choose to say yes, right? And trust God with the outcome. There's a quote in the book that says, the outcome is his, but the obedience is ours, right? And so there are those moments where we have to take that next step of faith, trusting that God will provide and sustain and enable us as only he can. And I think that is the $1,000,000 hard question of really leaning into the Holy Spirit's discernment in us and at work in us as we continue to follow Christ. And so that might be like the tough love and like big sister answer to the second half of your question, but those are the very real moments that I think we have to entrust to God.
Yeah, I love what you said. And I actually recall sometimes in my own life where I was asked to do something that would have been amazing, but I just didn't feel that I had the proper background yet to go out and do the thing yet. Yeah, maybe there could have been an element of fear, but I truly felt that in my heart, it wasn't time yet. Now let's talk about obedience. Was there ever a time in your life where you felt that you disobeyed God and didn't step out and call and do what he called you to do? Were there any repercussions for that?
Yeah, the time in my life that's coming to mind, and I will say I did say yes to God in this. So this is an example of maybe where I didn't say yes, which I can speak to here in a second. But a few years ago, me and my husband got married, and I married a lead pastor. So we were not the typical maybe ministry couple that grew up into ministry together. He was a lead pastor. I led a ministry and was writing and speaking before we got married. And so when I sort of grafted myself into his already existing life, he was he was the lead pastor of our church in South Mississippi, and I lived in East Tennessee. We had reconnected after he was on staff at the church that I attended many years prior to that. And so to connect the dots of our story. But when I married him, I also knew I was marrying into an entirely altogether different life than I lived while we were dating or before we started dating, right? So not only was I marrying a pastor, so by virtue of marrying him, I would become a lead pastor's wife. I would move 8 hours from everything I'd ever known and the life that, God had given me in the community and all of those things. And I was moving from East Tennessee, a beautiful, beautiful place, to a town of 12,000 people in South Mississippi. I
Wow.
mean, I left everything, right? And so there were those moments of, okay, Lord, I know this is what you're calling me to do. And also, there is so much surrender and laying down of my own desires in this decision, right? And all of us face those moments. I'm sure every listener of this episode could come to us and say, "Oh yeah, and this is my story and how God led me to surrender or obey in this specific area." And so I think back to your question of what happens if we don't, right? What's lost for us? What's lost for the kingdom if we don't? I think I would first come back to, as a follower of Christ, with the Holy Spirit residing in us, like God is worthy of our obedience. He's worthy of our obedience. So if I say nothing else, if nothing else is lost, it's an opportunity to worship God through what he's given us, right? As we obey him. So that's the foundational thing I would say. And then on top of that, man, it gives me so much joy to operate in the specific, unique gifts and talents God has given me within the community he has placed me within to build his kingdom. There's such joy in that, right? And I bet you would agree, Brittany, when you are using your gifts and talents to the glory of God, there's joy in that, and there's a blessing in that. And maybe this is selfish, but I don't want to miss that. I don't want to miss an ounce of how God desires to use me on this side of eternity, right? And so that's what I would probably plead to the listener who is struggling to say yes or to obey, take that next step is, man, I don't want you to miss using your gifts and talents to the glory of God, because there's just such great joy in it.
You know what you said actually takes me back to another story in my own life. There was a season where I wasn't walking in obedience with what God called me to do. And it wasn't crazy, like I was partying, drinking, doing drugs, none of that. It was just, I wasn't walking in obedience to what he had called me to do. And when I made that step of obedience and decided that I wanted to change my life, and again, it took a process, which also included healthy eating, exercise, taking your vitamins, getting that physical and mental clarity to the physical to help with your mental and emotional state. It made a huge difference in my life. And for sometimes I had to make a choice. Like today, I'm going to choose to do this. I didn't want to. I was feeling the same way as I was before, but I said, no, I'm going to. I get to do this. And of course, it's a process. We're going to have your seasons where you're going to be up and wanting to do it more. Other times where you're not wanting to do it as much. But as long as you're walking, hopefully, in the most consistency in the same direction, even if you have your bad days, that's what's important. Actually, as I was listening to Jonah came into my head, and I was thinking about his story of how he didn't always walk into obedience with God. That actually got him into the belly of a whale. But eventually, when he turned his life around and did what he was supposed to do, and he literally, I'm going to say, like, turned back to where he was supposed to go, things started changing. Yeah, those are just some thoughts that I had on that. So now I'm a little bit of a different direction. Can you explain the difference between a calling versus a career?
Yeah. Okay. Can I tack on something about Jonah?
Mhm.
Because I just don't think it's an accident that you brought Jonah up. And I had probably a 45-minute discussion about the book of Jonah with my husband last night, because he's preparing to teach on the book of Jonah on Wednesday.
No way.
Okay. So I just feel like this is pertinent. Jonah was running away from Nineveh, right? We see so listeners who aren't super familiar with the places and what I'm about to say, go read the book of Jonah and take what I'm about to say to that story. So there's Nineveh, right? The place that God had called him to, the people he had called him to. There's the place he was running from Nineveh to, and then there's the boat. In our lives, there's always a Nineveh, right? This people and this place that God's called us to. There are often these very tempting places that we can run to run away from where God has called us. And there's always a boat. There's always a boat, right? This tempting way that we can maybe distract ourselves from what God has called us to do, or maybe it's just an easy, like, well, certainly I'm not the girl for that job, so I'll just use my gifts over here, when in reality I know exactly where God has called me to go and who he's called me to serve. And so I think that object lesson of taking the book of Jonah and thinking, like, who is my Nineveh? Where is my Nineveh? And is there a boat that I'm very easily running to avoid where God's really called me? That object lesson has just really stuck with me for the last 24 hours. So I just didn't think it was by accident that you brought up the book of Jonah. And so I love that.
That's amazing. I had not been thinking about Jonah at all until you said something, and then just Jonah popped into my head. Yeah, the Holy Spirit is definitely working.
I think that's such a helpful thing to think through. And you raise a really good question of the difference between career and calling, right? And so I think this is something I'm still unraveling for myself, because I have had this corporate career, and in the midst of that, feeling called to ministry work. And I've also jumped into that head force long and am pursuing that now. And so I think, and maybe 10 years from now, I would answer this differently, but I think today how I would answer that is, we know that ultimately, as a follower of Christ, we are called to go and make disciples. Above it, like, full stop. If we do nothing else with our time here this side of eternity, we are to go and make disciples. Now, the expression of that, what that's going to look like on an everyday Monday or Tuesday for me, for you, Brittany, for the people coming to this episode, will look different for each of us, and it will look different in different seasons. So, were there very specific ways that I think God desired to use me within the context of corporate America in those years where I had more of a corporate career? Yes. And I can see fruit of that. And I pray that your listeners can say the same. I also know that God desires to use me in more of a ministerial capacity. But I don't think one is more significant or insignificant in the eyes of God. And I think that's where in our culture, in our Christian culture, we love to put labels on things that I just don't think God ever did. Right? Those moments where I was able to encourage a coworker in corporate America or sit on my couch and disciple a college student and walk them through a tough breakup situation. I think one day that might be more significant in the eyes of God than some moments where I stood on a stage, right? And pursued my calling, if you will, ministerially. And so I think that we place a value system on things that isn't maybe what God intended. And so I'm wondering how that resonates with you as you think about calling and career. Have you seen that to be true in your own life or seen that tension?
Actually, I had a friend in Bible school who his calling, well, his career was in science, but he was going and learning the same stuff that I was. And it was interesting because he's able to take what he learned theologically and reach others in his field that would have not listened to anyone else preaching the gospel to them because they are more of an intellectual mindset. So they would have different questions. So I think that was really cool that he was able to use his calling, preaching the gospel, in his field of career. I think it's important to remember that our career and our calling is not the same. Our calling is definitely what we're supposed to do is we're called to share the gospel, and our career is something different. And for some of us, we're able to do the career and calling as one. So you're a pastor's wife, and I'm sure that has helped give you a platform to what you have today. You obviously have a voice. Now, how does the role of like submission work, and who makes the decisions, or does it differ? Yeah, tell us about that.
I would say we've walked through different seasons of that. In the beginning, I'd never been a pastor's wife. So there's also, I have this calling on my life that in many senses is outside of the four walls of my local church. And also I'm married to a lead pastor. And so I will never not have the role of discipling women within our church and being involved where I feel God leading me to be involved. I think the challenge is the boundaries of that, right? Because we can't do it all. Yeah. And so to your point, before anything else, I am Dustin's wife. Nobody else has been called to that role. Right. And so am I faithfully supporting him, encouraging him, walking alongside him, allowing him to lead me and our family as we move forward. I will say, as a bold woman, it actually feels very freeing that it's not my job to be the head of our household. And I would challenge maybe some women who are wrestling with that passage, which is a passage that is highly debated, and what's biblical submission means. And again, that's a whole different conversation. But it actually feels so freeing to know that's not my job biblically. And so to allow him to lead actually is so incredibly freeing to me. And that's actually been like a beautiful dance, I think, in our marriage. And I pray it continues to be so. And I also want to say that doesn't come without its challenges, right? I'm married to a very bold man of God. And so when you mix a high achiever, bold woman with this audacious, bold, manly personality, there's some real challenges that come into a marriage like that. And also, I was talking with him just this weekend about like what a gift it is that I am married to a man, and I feel, and he communicated to me that he feels he's married to a woman who isn't just satisfied with the amount of God that he or she knows today, and that we are both just continually pursuing him, and I pray that's the case the rest of our days. And so I'm thankful for the amount of boldness that's in our house, even though it's a real challenge at times. So I say all that to say, I don't think we have it all figured out by any means, but I think it's a real gift if we choose to see it that way.
Now, the Lord created women to be the helper, and we actually do want to help. What advice would you give to the woman that wants to submit biblically to her husband, and but wants to help? But there's sometimes where she's like, I think I might know more than my husband in this situation, and she actually does. What advice would you give to her to be able to submit and without being a nag to him, but making sure that she is telling her husband, what needs to be told? And I was listening to a podcast and it had these YouTubers on it, Nick and Chelsea Hurst. And the wife on there, Chelsea, said, we're not called to be our husband's Holy Spirit. And I thought that was actually really cool. What advice would you give to her?
Yeah, man. First of all, that statement you just said was brilliant. You are not his Holy Spirit. You are not his Holy Spirit. And so assuming that he is a follower of Christ, that's what we're going to assume. Okay. If nagging begins to be the problem, and you can even sense that within yourself, right? Like, I don't even enjoy pursuing this conversation anymore because I just feel like I'm nagging him. I would also probably tap on what community exists in your marriage, right? I can think of seasons of our marriage, particularly the season when we were in Mississippi. We were pretty isolated in terms of being away from our friends and family. We had many friends who were so kind to us and great, great friends there, but they were all members of our church. Right. And so a unique challenge for a pastor's wife family is finding community outside of the four walls of your local church, because there's only so much vulnerability you can have with the people who are in your congregation. Right. That's just truth. And so I think, speaking from my own personal experience within the context of a Christian biblical marriage, I think I would tap on what other men are speaking into your husband's life and challenging him to grow in these particular areas. And maybe it is leading your family, or maybe it's, I don't know, being consistent in spiritual disciplines that we know need to be foundational for our family. Maybe it is encouraging him, hey, you need more men speaking into that. You need more voices other than just me. And I know, we both know this, Brittany. Sometimes a friend can say the exact same thing to us that our spouse says, and yet it doesn't fall on our ears the same way. Right? And I think the same is true in your spouse's life. And so that's what God, I think, is bringing to mind in maybe challenging a husband who isn't as naturally strong of a leader, is encouraging community.
Exactly. I've always believed that if a woman wants to get through the man in her life, and she needs to pray for him. There's like power in a praying woman, and that's part of being a helper. And actually, I was listening to a random sermon by Pastor just Jonathan Pokluda, and he talked about the importance of, I don't know if he said praying for your husbands, or the husband has to have godly men around him. So I think women can pray for that, for their husband, to have godly men around him, godly influences. Because sometimes, like, us women could be telling them something and they're just not wanting to listen. But if they hear it from their friends, all of a sudden they'll listen. It's like, and it goes back to iron sharpening iron. And why they may not hear it from us directly or want to hear it from us, all of a sudden their friend says it and it's so, wow, profound. But in reality, it's the women praying behind the scenes for their men to choose godly friends and to have godly influences around him. So it's like, It all works together. Now, okay, what practical tips do you have for women who want to start a podcast, YouTube? I mean, anything. They want to just do the thing. What advice would you give them for like, programs to use? Yeah. What do you think?
I love that. I always say I have my PhD in Canva. I use Canva probably every day, and it's such a helpful tool. Here's the one that's coming to mind above anything else, and it has more to do with vision and strategy than anything else, because I think if we don't have a foundation for where we're headed and how we're going to block our time to move forward and take those steps of obedience, we're never going to get there, right? And so the planner that I have been using for the last 3 or 4 years that I have found to be so helpful is the Full Focus Planner by Michael Hyatt. You're nodding like you've heard of it.
I've heard of him. Definitely Michael Hyatt.
Yeah. It is an incredible tool. I love the way that it's laid out. It has individual daily planning pages where you can kind of map out your day and the tasks that you want to complete. And I'm just a to-do list girl. I just will never not be that kind of girl. And so I just find it to be so helpful in organizing my life. I will say it has been a lifesaver in the midst of launching this book, because there's so much going on that it just gives a really good framework for how to organize my life. And so that's coming to mind. I also would say probably the third tool that I use the most right now is Trello. And so it's more of a project management tool. And I have found it to be most helpful in planning my production calendar for my podcast. So if you were to start a blog, a podcast, whatever the medium is, I actually use it as my calendar. And so it allows you to upload files and pictures and graphics and show notes. And so I house everything for every particular episode of my podcast in a card within a board on Trello. And I actually have found that to be super helpful. It also has a mobile app. And so what's great is if I'm at lunch with somebody and they say, "Hey, have you ever thought about having so-and-so on your podcast?" And I'm not near my laptop, I can go, "Oh, let me capture that really quick in my Trello board so that I don't forget to come back to it later." I've also outlined books in Trello as well and use that as kind of a storyboarding tool. And so it's definitely versatile in that way and what you can use it for. So those are a couple that come to mind. I could talk for way longer, but I'll be quiet and move on.
Now, where can we find your book and where can we find you online?
Love it. Well, I am so excited to, like I said, just start having these conversations and connecting these dots, particularly for women that would be kind of the primary audience of the book, and how we use our gifts and talents to the glory of God. And so you can pre-order the book or order the book, depending on when this will air, wherever you like to buy books, Barnes and Noble, Christian Book, Amazon. And I'm so excited about this series that we're doing over on the Radical Radiance podcast. That's the podcast that I host. Each Tuesday we release episodes, and we're going to be doing an episode about every individual chapter of Do the Thing for 12 weeks straight. And God has just really been blessing these conversations, and they've been such an encouragement to my heart. And so as you're walking through the material in the book, feel free to hop on over and give those a listen for some additional content as well. And there's also a video series that comes along with the book that I think is really special. I think kind of the old model of video curriculum would have you buying an extra leader guide and DVDs and all of that stuff. And the great thing about how this book is formatted is with the purchase of the book, you get a QR code kind of embedded there in the book that gives you access to all the video content. And so if you're going through the book alone and you just want a cheerleader along the way, I'm there to kind of kick you off every couple of chapters and give you some additional content. And if you're doing some sort of book club or small group, it's a great way to kick off your sessions together. And so I'd want to mention that as well as people are considering the book, because it's fun additional content.
Rebecca, thank you so much for chatting with me today. I really enjoyed the wisdom that you had to share with myself and my audience. I appreciate it. All right, friends, did you enjoy my chat with Rebecca? Was there anything that stood out to you that we shared? I love the wisdom that she shared here, as I feel like every time I'm on a podcast, I'm learning new things as I'm talking to different people. So it's always a blessing. All right, if you guys like this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and of course, hit the notification bell and share it with all your friends. And don't forget to follow me on social media. It's pretty much just Brittany at Brittany Valadez everywhere. Make sure to check out my website, bravelydayly.com. And until next time, I'm Brittany Valadez. God bless, and I'll see you in the next one.